What if the secrets to amazing learning weren't just hidden in fancy tech, but in dusty old scrolls from centuries ago? What if the way we teach today is missing something vital, something powerful that people in the Middle Ages knew all about? Get ready to explore 8 forgotten medieval teaching methods from a time roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries that might just blow your mind. Number 8. Apprenticeship and guild system. Forget lecture halls, forget endless textbooks. Back in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to learn how to build a cathedral or weave a tapestry, you didn't just read about it, you lived. This was the world of the apprenticeship and the powerful guild system, a way of learning that was completely wrapped up in daily life and real-world skills. It was hands-on, inner narrative, and pretty much the ultimate version of learning by doing. So, how did it work? If you were a young person, maybe around 12 or 14 years old, and you wanted to become a blacksmith, a baker, a shoemaker, a carpenter, or even a painter, you wouldn't sign up for school. Instead, your parents would arrange for you to become an apprentice to a master craftsman. This wasn't just a part-time job. It was a commitment, usually lasting 7 years, sometimes even longer, depending on the craft. An indenture contract, a formal agreement written down, would bind you to the master. This contract spelled out everything: how long you would serve, what the master would provide, and what you were expected to learn. You would move into the master's house. You ate at his table, slept under his roof, and became part of his household. In exchange for your labor, often unpaid, you received food, lodging, and, most importantly, expert training. This wasn't just about learning how to swing a hammer or knead dough. It was about learning the entire trade, from the simplest tasks to the most complex techniques. Your day would start early, often before dawn. You'd help with chores around the house and shop, light fires, clean tools, fetch water. As you gained experience, you'd move on to more specific tasks related to the craft. A young apprentice to a baker might start by grinding grain, then move on to mixing dough, tending the oven, and eventually shaping loaves. An apprentice mason might carry stones, mix mortar, and then learn to cut and lay bricks with precision. It was slow, careful learning repeated day after day, until the movements became second nature, until the skills were etched into your very being. The master was your teacher, your boss, and often a father figure. They taught not just the skills, but also the trade secrets, the unwritten rules, the quality standards that defined the guild. Guilds were powerful organizations of craftsmen who worked in the same trade. Think of them like super exclusive clubs for artisans, but with serious power to control quality, prices, and training. They set the rules for apprenticeships, making sure that every new craftsman was properly trained and met high standards. If a master produced shoddy work, the guild could impose fines or even expel them. This ensured that medieval crafts were often of incredibly high quality. Let's take the example of a weaving apprentice. They would learn to prepare the raw wool, clean it, card it, and spin it into thread. They would learn how to set up the loom, a complex piece of machinery, thread by painstaking thread. They would learn about different dyes, how to mix them from natural ingredients like woad for blue or madder for red, and how to apply them evenly to the fabric. They would learn intricate patterns and how to fix mistakes in the weave. This wasn't just about making cloth. It was about understanding the entire process, from sheep to finished garment, from raw material to masterpiece. After your years as an apprentice, if your master deemed you ready, you would become a journeyman. The word journeyman comes from the French word journée, meaning day, because they were paid by the day. Journeymen were skilled workers who had completed their apprenticeship but hadn't yet achieved mastery. This was a crucial stage. It was a time to travel, to work for different masters in different towns, to learn new techniques and perspectives. A journeyman mason might work on a cathedral in one city, then move to another to help build a castle. This travel broadened their experience, exposed them to different styles and innovations, and helped them refine their craft. They gained independence and a wider understanding of their trade. To become a master yourself, you had to prove your skill to the guild. This usually involved creating a masterpiece, a complex and high-quality piece of work that demonstrated your complete command of the craft. A shoemaker might create a pair of elaborate, perfectly fitted boots. A painter might produce a stunning altarpiece. These masterpieces were often judged by a panel of existing masters. If your masterpiece was approved, and you had enough money to set up your own shop and contribute to the guild, you could finally become a master. You could then open your own business, take on your own apprentices, and contribute to the cycle of knowledge transfer. This system wasn't just about practical skills. It instilled discipline, patience, and a deep respect for the craft. Apprentices learned problem solving on the spot, dealing with imperfect materials or unexpected challenges. They learned the value of hard work and the satisfaction of creating something tangible and useful. The master-apprentice relationship was a form of mentorship that extended beyond the workshop. Apprentices learned social skills, how to interact with customers, how to manage a business, and how to contribute to their community. The guild system also created a sense of community and solidarity among craftsmen. They had shared interests, helped each other out, and collectively protected the standards of their trade. Guilds often had their own feast days, patron saints, and mutual aid societies providing support for members and their families in times of sickness or hardship. They were powerful economic and social forces in medieval towns, ensuring quality control and fostering excellence. Historians like Stephen A. Epstein often point to the stability and high standards that guilds maintained across various trades in Europe. The city of Florence, for example, had powerful guilds for wool, silk, banking, and many other trades, each contributing to the city's wealth and prestige. This method of learning was slow, deliberate, and deeply experiential. It wasn't about quick results or standardized tests. It was about a complete immersion in a skill, a way of life, and a community. Produced craftsmen and artisans who were not just skilled workers, but true masters of their trade, capable of creating the incredible structures and objects that still amaze us today. From the intricate carvings on a cathedral door to the precise workings of an early clock, the medieval apprenticeship system shaped a world built by highly trained, dedicated hands. Number 7. The Trivium and Quadrivium. Imagine a world where the very foundation of your education wasn't just about memorizing facts, but about learning how to think, how to argue, and how to express yourself with absolute clarity. That was the core of the medieval liberal arts curriculum, divided into two main parts, the Trivium and the Quadrivium. These weren't just subjects. They were intellectual tools designed to equip students for a lifetime of rigorous thought and deep understanding. The Trivium came first. Its name comes from the Latin tri meaning three and via meaning road. So literally, the three roads. These three roads were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They were considered the foundational arts, the necessary groundwork for all further learning. First up was grammar. This wasn't just about knowing verb, conjugations, and sentence structure, though those were certainly part of it. Medieval grammar was about understanding language itself deeply and thoroughly. It involved learning Latin, which was the language of scholarship, law, and the church across Europe. Students would immerse themselves in classical texts, especially the works of ancient Roman authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid. They learned not just what the words meant, but how they were put together, how syntax conveyed meaning, and how different literary forms work. It was about developing a comprehensive understanding of language as a tool for clear thought and communication. Students would copy texts, analyze sentences, and practice writing their own Latin compositions. The aim was to build a strong foundation, to learn the rules of language so well that you could then manipulate them creatively and precisely. Think of it as mastering the alphabet and vocabulary before you can write a novel. Next came logic, sometimes called dialectic. This was the art of clear thinking and reasoning. Students learned how to construct sound arguments, how to identify logical fallacies, and how to engage in intellectual debate. They studied the works of Aristotle, particularly his Organon, which laid out the principles of logic. They learned about syllogisms, deductions, and inductions. They practiced breaking down complex ideas into their component parts, identifying premises and conclusions. The goal was to train the mind to be sharp, critical, and able to discern truth from falsehood. Imagine a classroom where, instead of just listening to a lecture, students were constantly challenged to defend their positions, to spot flaws in arguments, and to build watertight reasoning. This wasn't about winning an argument through aggression. It was about seeking truth through careful, reasoned discourse. Finally, there was rhetoric. If grammar taught you how to speak and write correctly, and logic taught you how to think clearly, then rhetoric taught you how to persuade and express yourself beautifully and effectively. This involved studying the great orators of antiquity, like Cicero and Quintilian. Students learned about different rhetorical devices, figures of speech, tropes, and various styles of presentation. They practiced public speaking, learning how to structure a speech, how to appeal to an audience, and how to deliver their message with impact. This wasn't about empty persuasion. It was about presenting logical arguments in an eloquent and compelling way. It was crucial for anyone who would go on to be a lawyer, a theologian, a preacher, or a statesman. Professor Richard McKeon, in his studies of rhetorical theory, often highlighted the medieval emphasis on rhetoric as a means of discovering and conveying truth, not just winning debates. Once a student had mastered the trivium, they were ready for the quadrivium, the four roads. These were the mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These subjects were seen as a deeper dive into the nature of reality, revealing the underlying order and harmony of the universe. Arithmetic wasn't just basic counting. It was about the properties of numbers themselves, their relationships, and their philosophical significance. It involved studying the theories of number laid out by ancient Greek mathematicians like Pythagoras and Euclid. Students explored ratios, proportions, and the abstract nature of numbers. They learned to calculate, of course, but the emphasis was often on the theoretical and philosophical aspects of mathematics, seeing numbers as expressions of divine order. Geometry extended this understanding to space and form. Students studied Euclid's Elements, the foundational text for geometry, learning about lines, angles, shapes, and solids. They explored theorems and proofs, developing their spatial reasoning and problem-solving skills in a visual context. This was vital for architects, builders, and artists, but also for anyone seeking to understand the order of the physical world. Principles learned here were applied in everything from building cathedrals to designing intricate patterns in stained glass. Astronomy, in the medieval context, was closely linked to astrology and the study of the heavens. It involved observing the movements of the stars and planets, understanding celestial cycles, and charting their paths. This was practical for navigation, for determining the calendar, and for understanding the rhythm of seasons. But it also had a deep philosophical and theological dimension, as the orderly movements of the heavens were seen as a manifestation of God's perfect design. Students would study treatises like Ptolemy's Almagest and learn to use instruments like the astrolabe. They sought to understand the cosmos as a harmonious, ordered system. Finally, there was music. This might seem surprising alongside math and science, but medieval music education was deeply rooted in mathematical principles. It wasn't just about playing instruments. It was about understanding the mathematical ratios and proportions that create harmony and melody. Students studied music theory, the relationships between notes, intervals, and scales. They explored the philosophical idea that music was a reflection of the cosmic harmony, the music of the spheres. Understanding these mathematical relationships in music was considered another way to understand the underlying structure of the universe. Boethius's De Institutione Musica was a highly influential text in this regard, shaping musical thought for centuries. Trivium and Quadrivium together formed the backbone of a medieval university education. Students who completed these studies were considered liberal in the sense that they were free to think critically, to express themselves clearly, and to understand the world around them. This comprehensive approach trained students not just in specific subjects, but in the fundamental intellectual skills necessary for any field of study, whether it was theology, law, or medicine. It was an education designed to create well-rounded, articulate, and rigorously analytical thinkers, capable of navigating complex ideas and contributing meaningfully to their world. Number 6. Oral tradition and storytelling. Before books were widely available, before mass printing presses, and even before widespread literacy, how did people learn about their history, their heroes, their laws, and their moral values? The answer lies in the powerful and enduring art of oral tradition and storytelling. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just entertainment. It was a primary method of education, a living library passed down from one generation to the next, often by skilled practitioners. Imagine a long winter evening in a communal hall, a fire crackling in the hearth, and a gathering of people listening intently to a storyteller. This wasn't a rare event. It was how communities connected with their past and reinforced their identity. Professional storytellers, often known as bards, scops, or griots in different cultures, held immense respect. They were the custodians of collective memory, the living encyclopedias of their people. They memorized vast amounts of information: epic poems, sagas, genealogies, laws, and historical narratives. Let's think about the epic poems like Beowulf or the Song of Roland. These weren't just written down for later reading. They were composed to be performed, to be recited aloud, often with musical accompaniment. The storyteller would use rhythm, repetition, dramatic pauses, and vivid imagery to captivate their audience. Listeners, young and old, would absorb the tales, learning about courage, loyalty, treachery, and the consequences of actions. They learned about the social norms and expectations of their society, seeing them played out through the lives of legendary figures. The structure of these poems, with their alliterative verse and recurring formulas, also served as a mnemonic device, making them easier for the performer to remember and for the audience to recall. This method of learning was deeply communal. Knowledge wasn't something you acquired alone in a quiet room. It was shared, discussed, and reinterpreted within the group. After a story was told, there might be discussions, questions, and further elaborations. This active engagement helped solidify the learning. Young people would hear these stories repeatedly throughout their childhood, allowing the narratives to sink in to become part of their understanding of the world. Beyond epic tales, storytelling also served as a vital way to transmit practical knowledge. How did you know which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous? Often, this knowledge was embedded in stories, rhymes, or proverbs, passed down orally. Farmers would share stories about the best times to plant and harvest, based on generations of observation. Fishermen would share tales of dangerous currents or abundant fishing grounds. These weren't abstract facts. They were knowledge woven into memorable narratives, making them easier to recall and apply in real-life situations. Religious instruction heavily relied on oral tradition as well. Before widespread literacy, sermons were crucial for teaching Christian doctrine, parables, and biblical narratives to the common people. Priests would tell stories from the Bible, explain the lives of saints, and impart moral lessons through vivid accounts. Stained glass windows and murals in churches also served as visual stories illustrating biblical scenes for an illiterate populace, reinforcing the oral teachings. People learned morality, ethics, and their spiritual beliefs through these shared narratives. Accounts from monastic chroniclers like Bede in his ecclesiastical history of the English people show how stories of saints and miracles were used to teach and inspire faith. Even legal knowledge was often transmitted orally. Many early legal systems relied on spoken declarations and memorized precedents. Laws were often recited aloud in public gatherings, ensuring that the community was aware of their rights and obligations. Royal decrees and proclamations were announced by heralds, ensuring that the news reached the furthest corners of the kingdom through spoken word. This ensured that knowledge was not restricted to a literate elite, but was accessible to everyone in the community. The effectiveness of oral tradition stemmed from several factors. First, it engaged emotions and imagination, making the learning process far more captivating than simply reading dry facts. Second, the repetition inherent in oral transmission reinforced memory. Third, it fostered a deep connection between the listener and the knowledge, as the stories often linked to their own identity and cultural heritage. The stories were often personalized, adapted slightly by each teller, making them living, breathing entities rather than static texts. Irish tradition of the Fili, a class of poets and scholars, is a prime example of the depth of oral learning. These individuals underwent years of rigorous training, memorizing thousands of stories, poems, and legal precedents. Their minds were encyclopedias of lore, and they held immense power and prestige in society. This extensive learning was entirely dependent on memory and oral transmission. Oral tradition wasn't just about preserving the past. It was also about creating new knowledge and adapting old tales to new circumstances. Storytellers would sometimes incorporate contemporary events or local details into classic narratives, making them relevant to their immediate audience. It was a dynamic, evolving form of education that shaped medieval minds and communities, connecting them to their ancestors and providing a shared understanding of their world. It teaches us that deep learning doesn't always require a book, but often benefits from a captivating voice and a compelling tale. Number 5. Disputation and debate. Scholastic method. If you wanted to truly understand an idea in the medieval university, you didn't just read about it or listen to a lecture. You argued about it fiercely, rigorously, and sometimes for hours on end. This was the heart of the scholastic method, centered on disputation and debate. It was a dynamic intellectual wrestling match designed to uncover truth through systematic argument and counter-argument. Imagine a crowded university hall. Students and masters gathered around. A master would propose a question, often a complex theological, philosophical, or legal dilemma. It might be something like, is it possible for God to know contingent future events? Or, is the soul separable from the body? This wasn't a simple yes or no question. It was an invitation to a deep, structured intellectual battle. The process began with a quaestio, or question. Then, arguments would be presented for the affirmative and the negative, pro and contra. Students, often senior ones or junior masters, would be assigned to defend one side, even if it wasn't their personal belief. This forced them to think critically about different perspectives, to understand the strengths and weaknesses of opposing arguments. They couldn't just parrot back what they had heard. They had to construct coherent, logical arguments based on reason and authority. A typical disputation would follow a specific format. First, objections would be raised against the proposed answer. Someone would argue, "It seems that the proposed answer is false because reason 1 and reason 2," citing a revered authority like Aristotle or Augustine. Then arguments would be presented in favor of the proposed answer, often beginning with, "On the contrary, greater reason," citing another authority. Finally, the master or the main speaker would present their determination or resolution to the question. This wasn't just stating their opinion. They would carefully analyze each of the objections raised earlier, showing why they were flawed or how they could be reconciled with the main argument. They would demonstrate how the various authorities, even if they seemed to contradict each other, could be understood in a harmonious way. This required incredible intellectual agility, a deep knowledge of texts, and a masterful command of logic and rhetoric. One of the most famous examples of this method is found in the works of Thomas Aquinas, especially his monumental Summa Theologica. This massive text is structured exactly like a series of disputations. For every question, he lists objections, then arguments for the opposite side, and finally his own detailed resolution, meticulously addressing each objection. Reading the Summa is like witnessing a silent, scholarly debate unfolding on the page. His method was not about expressing personal opinion, but about systematically exploring all possible arguments and finding the most reasoned, coherent truth. The benefits of this method were immense. Trained students to think critically, to analyze information, and to construct persuasive arguments. It developed their public speaking skills and their ability to think on their feet. It taught them to engage with complex ideas respectfully, even when disagreeing. It wasn't about winning an argument for the sake of it, but about the collective pursuit of truth. By forcing students to defend positions they might not personally hold, it fostered intellectual empathy and a deeper understanding of diverse viewpoints. Disputations weren't limited to the university. They were a common feature of intellectual life in monasteries and cathedral schools. Even outside formal academic settings, the principles of logical argument and respectful debate were valued. This method cultivated an intellectual humility where one learned that even the most brilliant mind could be wrong, and that truth often emerged from the clash of ideas rather than from solitary contemplation. Medieval scholars didn't see themselves as inventing new knowledge out of nothing. Instead, they saw themselves as building upon the wisdom of the past, especially the ancient Greeks and Romans, and the Church Fathers. They would cite Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, Boethius, and other respected thinkers. The challenge was to reconcile seemingly conflicting authorities, to find the underlying unity in diverse traditions. This forced students to engage deeply with primary texts and to understand the nuances of different philosophical and theological traditions. As historian Gordon Leff describes in his work on medieval thought, the scholastic method was about ordering and distinguishing, bringing clarity to a vast body of knowledge. Imagine the mental stamina required for such a session. Students would spend hours listening, analyzing, and formulating their own counter-arguments. They learned to anticipate their opponent's moves, to spot weak points in their reasoning, and to buttress their own arguments with solid evidence and logical steps. It was intellectual training at its most intense. This method also ensured that knowledge was not static. While it revered tradition, it also pushed for progress. By constantly questioning and debating, scholars identified gaps in understanding, refined existing theories, and occasionally even developed new ones. It was a dynamic process of intellectual evolution. The scholastic method of disputation and debate was a cornerstone of medieval learning, transforming passive listeners into active critical thinkers. It was a rigorous training ground for minds, preparing them to engage with the most profound questions of their age with precision, clarity, and intellectual courage. It teaches us that sometimes The best way to learn is to put your ideas on trial and let them stand up to the scrutiny of open, structured argument. Number 4. Pilgrimage as experiential learning. Forget classrooms with 4 walls. In the Middle Ages, one of the most profound ways to learn about the world, about faith, about different cultures, and even about yourself, was to embark on a pilgrimage. This wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was an immersive, multi-sensory educational experience that exposed travelers to a vast tapestry of knowledge far beyond what any book could convey. Imagine walking for weeks, months, or even years, often thousands of miles towards a sacred site like Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Pilgrims came from all walks of life: peasants, merchants, knights, and even royalty. They undertook these arduous journeys for various reasons: seeking spiritual merit, fulfilling a vow, asking for a miracle, or doing penance. But regardless of the motivation, the journey itself was a profound learning experience. First, there was geographical and logistical knowledge. Pilgrims had to learn how to navigate unknown territories. They learned about different landscapes, river crossings, mountain passes, and the best routes to avoid bandits or dangerous terrain. They learned about the changing seasons and how they affected travel. This wasn't abstract map reading. It was practical, survival-based geography. They learned about different types of roads, from Roman-era stone paths to muddy tracks, and how to find shelter and sustenance along the way. Manuals and guidebooks, like those written for the Camino de Santiago, offered advice on places to stay, safe roads, and local customs. Then came the exposure to different cultures and languages. As pilgrims traversed different regions, they encountered people with distinct customs, dialects, and ways of life. Pilgrim from England journeying through France and then Italy would hear different languages spoken, see different styles of architecture, taste different foods, and observe different social practices. This broke down provincialism and fostered a broader understanding of the diverse human experience. They learned to communicate, often through gestures or a few shared words, or by relying on local hospices run by religious orders that catered to travelers. This kind of interaction was a living lesson in anthropology and cultural studies. Far more visceral than any lecture, pilgrimage also offered lessons in economics and trade. Travelers observed different markets, encountered various currencies, and learned about local produce and crafts. They saw how goods were transported and exchanged across vast distances. They might even have to trade or barter for supplies, honing their negotiation skills. They would pass through bustling towns and quiet villages, gaining a practical understanding of medieval commerce and the varied economies of different regions. The merchants and traders who often joined pilgrimage groups brought their own commercial knowledge and practices, further enriching the learning environment. Of course, the spiritual and moral learning was paramount. The hardships of the journey, hunger, thirst, fatigue, illness, danger, often served as a crucible for personal growth. Pilgrims learned patience, perseverance, and reliance on faith. They encountered other pilgrims from diverse backgrounds, sharing stories, hardships, and companionship. This fostered a sense of shared humanity and deepened their spiritual understanding. They visited countless churches, monasteries, and shrines along the way, learning about local saints, relics, and regional religious traditions. They absorbed the stories embedded in church art, sculpture, and architecture, which served as a visual catechism. Historian Jonathan Sumption, in his works on medieval pilgrimage, emphasizes how these journeys were jicky experiences, shaping not just belief, but also a pilgrim's understanding of the wider world. Beyond the spiritual, there was also a practical learning about community and hospitality. Monasteries, hospices, and private individuals often provided shelter and food for pilgrims. This fostered a sense of shared humanity and charity. Pilgrims learned about the networks of support that existed across Europe, driven by religious devotion. They experienced acts of kindness and generosity, which in turn taught them the value of compassion and mutual aid. They also learned to be resourceful, to adapt to challenging circumstances, and to rely on others. The sheer physical challenge of pilgrimage taught valuable lessons about the human body and its limits, about endurance and resilience. Navigating rough terrain, facing inclement weather, and enduring hunger and fatigue were all part of the experience. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was raw, embodied learning. They learned about basic medicine, home remedies, and the importance of rest. Pilgrimage provided a unique form of informal education. It wasn't structured in a classroom, but every step of the journey, every encounter, every hardship, and every moment of wonder was a lesson. Pilgrims returned home not just with spiritual merit or a relic, but with a vastly expanded worldview, a deeper understanding of human diversity, and a richer appreciation for the complexities of the world beyond their immediate village. They became living libraries of their experiences, sharing their stories and knowledge with their communities. Thus, continuing the cycle of informal education teaches us that sometimes the greatest lessons are learned not by reading about the world, but by walking through it. Number 3. Memorization through chanting and song. Today, memorization sometimes gets a bad rap, seen as rote learning without true understanding. But in the Middle Ages, especially in monastic schools and early universities, memorization was a highly valued skill, and one of its most powerful tools was chanting and song. This wasn't just about repetition. It was about engaging multiple senses and tapping into the natural rhythm of language and music to embed information deeply into the mind. Imagine a group of monks gathered in a scriptorium or a choir, their voices rising and falling in unison, chanting long passages of scripture, liturgical texts, or even complex legal codes. This was a common scene. Chanting, or intoning, helped learners commit vast amounts of text to memory. The rhythm, the melody, and the communal nature of the activity made the material more engaging and easier to recall. Monasteries were centers of learning, and monks spent a significant portion of their lives memorizing. They would chant psalms, prayers, and entire books of the Bible. The Gregorian chant, for instance, is not just beautiful music. It's a centuries-old system for orally transmitting sacred texts. The specific melodic lines and rhythmic patterns were designed to assist memory and reinforce understanding of the Latin words. A monk could recall a specific passage not just by its content, but by the tune associated with it. This technique was incredibly effective for long-form texts, allowing individuals to carry entire libraries in their minds. Beyond religious texts, this method was applied to other subjects as well. Early medical students might chant anatomical terms or lists of remedies. Legal scholars might chant legal precedents or lists of rights and obligations. Even basic arithmetic could be learned through rhythmic chanting. Consistent beat and recurring phrases created a powerful mnemonic aid, making difficult concepts more accessible and durable in memory. Consider the role of the wandering scholar or Goliard. These were often students who traveled between universities, sometimes without much money, but always with a wealth of memorized knowledge. They would learn poetry, philosophical arguments, and even some scientific texts by rote, often with rhythmic recitation. Their ability to recall long passages and recite them publicly was a testament to the power of this method. They could share knowledge, participate in debates, and even earn their keep through their intellectual prowess, all built on a foundation of rigorous memorization. This wasn't just about passive repetition. The act of chanting required active participation. It engaged the vocal cords, the ears, and the brain simultaneously. Physical act of producing the sound combined with hearing it and processing the meaning created a multisensory learning experience. This engagement of multiple pathways in the brain likely strengthened memory traces, making the information more robustly stored. Furthermore, the communal aspect of chanting fostered a shared understanding. When a group chanted together, they were not just memorizing individually, they were building a collective memory. Any mistakes could be corrected by others, and the shared rhythm created a sense of unity and purpose. This peer reinforcement was a powerful learning tool. Professor Mary Carruthers, in her work, The Book of Memory, highlights the medieval emphasis on memory as a constructed, active faculty, and practices like chanting were central to this construction. She describes how the mind was seen as a storehouse that needed to be actively filled and organized through such techniques. Think about how children learn the alphabet or nursery rhymes today. The rhythm and melody make them easy to remember. Medieval educators understood this natural human tendency and applied it to complex adult learning. They used these inherent human capacities for rhythm and melody to tackle massive amounts of information. The result was not just memorization for the sake of it, but memorization as a foundation for deeper understanding and complex thought. Once a text was committed to memory, it could be called upon instantly, analyzed, cross-referenced, and debated. This allowed for mental agility and intellectual flexibility, as scholars could manipulate ideas they held entirely in their minds. This method also bypassed the limitations of scarce written materials. In a time when books were painstakingly copied by hand and extremely expensive, relying on oral transmission and memorization was a necessity. It ensured that knowledge could be disseminated and preserved even without widespread literacy or access to vast libraries. A person's memory was their most valuable intellectual asset, and techniques like chanting were key to cultivating and maintaining that asset. From the chanting of epics by bards to the daily recitation of psalms in monasteries and the intoning of legal statutes in early courts, the power of rhythm and song in medieval learning was undeniable. It transformed daunting amounts of information into something more digestible, more engaging, and ultimately more memorable. It teaches us that perhaps our brains are hardwired to learn through sound and rhythm, and that revisiting these ancient techniques could unlock new ways to absorb and retain knowledge today. Number 2. Scribing and illumination. In an age before printing presses, every single book was a unique, handcrafted object. Learning to read and write, especially in Latin, was a specialized skill, and a primary method of acquiring this skill and a vast amount of knowledge was through the painstaking process of scribing and illumination. This wasn't just copying, it was an intense, multi-sensory learning experience that combined literacy, artistry, and deep engagement with the text. Imagine a quiet scriptorium in a monastery, filled with the scratching of quills on parchment, the faint smell of ink, and the soft rustle of pages. Young monks, often starting as novices, would spend countless hours at carols, copying texts by hand. This was their education. They weren't just transcribing words, they were absorbing them. The process began with learning to form letters precisely and consistently. This required immense discipline and fine motor skills. Each letter had to be perfect in a specific script, like Carolingian, minuscule, or Gothic text. They learned about spacing, line height, and page layout. This meticulous attention to detail trained their eye and hand, developing a visual literacy alongside their linguistic one. They learned to control their quills made from bird feathers and to mix their own inks from various pigments and binders. This practical artisanal skill was integral to their intellectual development. As scribes copied texts, they were forced to engage with the material on a profound level. They read each word, absorbed its meaning, and then meticulously reproduced it. This slow, deliberate process often led to a deeper understanding of the content than a quick read might. When copying a theological treatise, a philosophical text, or a historical chronicle, the scribe wasn't just performing a mechanical task. They were internalizing the arguments, the narratives, and the ideas. They were, in a very real sense, becoming one with the text. Some scholars argue that this active process of writing by hand leads to stronger neural pathways and better memory retention. Beyond mere copying, many scribes also became illuminators. Illumination was the art of decorating manuscripts with intricate designs, decorative initials, and miniature illustrations. This was a whole separate skill set, requiring knowledge of color, theory, drawing, and often gilding, using real gold leaf. A scribe might spend months or even years on a single manuscript, transforming it from a mere collection of words into a stunning work of art. Learning illumination involved mastering the preparation of pigments from natural sources, crushing lapis lazuli for blue, grinding malachite for green, or using plant extracts for other colors. They learned how to apply gesso for raised gold, how to burnish gold leaf to a gleaming shine, and how to paint miniature scenes with incredible detail. Using tiny brushes made from fine hairs, this fusion of literary and artistic skills was unique. The illustrations were not just pretty pictures. They often served to clarify or emphasize points in the text, acting as a visual commentary. They helped to make complex ideas more accessible and memorable, particularly for a partly or wholly illiterate audience who might view the book. Consider the Book of Kells, a masterpiece of insular illumination created by Celtic monks around the 9th century. Its pages are filled with incredibly intricate knots, fantastic creatures, and vibrant colors, all illustrating the Gospels. The monks who created it were not just scribes, but master artists, their knowledge of Scripture deeply intertwined with their artistic expression. The act of creating such a book was itself an act of profound learning and devotion. It demonstrated an understanding of theological concepts and biblical narratives translated into visual form. This method of learning also instilled a deep respect for the written word and for knowledge itself. Every book was a treasure, a testament to human ingenuity and intellectual effort. The act of creating a book was seen as a sacred duty, preserving knowledge for future generations. This fostered a sense of responsibility and reverence towards scholarship. Scribing and illumination weren't just for monks. In urban centers, professional scribes and artists worked in workshops to produce books for wealthy patrons, lawyers, and nobility. Young apprentices in these workshops would learn the same demanding skills, eventually becoming master calligraphers and illuminators themselves. This also meant learning about the business side of book production, from sourcing materials to managing commissions. Patience, precision, and sustained focus required for scribing and illumination were immense. It was a slow, deliberate form of learning, in stark contrast to the fast-paced, information-saturated environment we often inhabit today. It taught endurance, self-discipline, and a profound engagement with the material being studied. It wasn't about speed or efficiency. It was about depth and perfection. This method reminds us that learning can be a deeply embodied practice, where the physical act of creation enhances cognitive understanding. It shows that the intersection of literacy and artistry can lead to unique forms of knowledge, acquisition, and expression. The medieval scribe and illuminator was not just a copyist, but a scholar, an artist, and a guardian of knowledge, whose meticulous work brought texts to life and shaped the very understanding of their world. Number 1. Learning from nature, in hortus conclusus. In the bustling medieval world, learning didn't always happen in grand universities or bustling workshops. Sometimes, the most profound lessons were found in the quiet, contained beauty of a garden. The hortus conclusus, Latin for enclosed garden, was more than just a place for growing plants. It was a living classroom, a laboratory, and a sanctuary for contemplation, offering a unique form of experiential learning, especially within monastic communities. Imagine stepping through a small gate into a peaceful courtyard, walled off from the chaos of the outside world. Here, amidst fragrant herbs, colorful flowers, and carefully cultivated plants, medieval students, often monks or nuns, would learn about the natural world directly. This was hands-on botany, pharmacy, and even spiritual contemplation, all rolled into one. The typical monastic garden was often divided into distinct sections. There was the herb garden, or herbularius, filled with medicinal plants. Here students would learn to identify hundreds of different herbs: chamomile for calming, mint for digestion, sage for memory, poppy for pain relief. They learned not just to recognize the plant, but to understand its properties, its growth cycle, and how to prepare it into remedies. This was practical pharmacology, developed through centuries of observation and trial. They would gather the plants, dry them, grind them, and mix them into poultices, tinctures, and infusions. This direct engagement with the plant world fostered a deep understanding of natural healing. Next to the herb garden might be the hortus, or kitchen garden, where vegetables and fruit trees were grown for food. Here students learned about agriculture, soil management, crop rotation, and the rhythm of the seasons. They learned about the interdependence of plants and the necessary labor for sustenance. This was crucial for the self-sufficiency of the monastery, but also taught valuable lessons in ecology and sustainable living long before those terms existed. They learned about grafting fruit trees, pruning vines, and protecting crops from pests. Then there was often a viridarium, or ornamental garden, designed for beauty and contemplation. While seemingly just for aesthetics, these gardens were places for quiet reflection and spiritual learning. The geometric layouts, the symbolism of certain plants, like the lily for purity or the rose for devotion, and the very act of tending to something beautiful were considered spiritual exercises. Students learned about the order and harmony of creation, seeing God's design reflected in the intricate details of a flower or the perfect symmetry of a garden path. This form of learning fostered mindfulness and a connection to the divine through nature. The Hortus Conclusus was also a place for observation and systematic study. Monks, like the famous Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, scholar, and mystic, extensively studied plants in her monastic garden. Her works, like Physica and Causae Curae, recorded detailed observations of medicinal plants and their uses, showing a blend of empirical knowledge and spiritual insight. Her knowledge was derived directly from observing, cultivating, and experimenting with the plants in her own garden. This method of learning taught patience and a respect for natural processes. You couldn't rush a plant's growth. You had to work with its cycles, understanding the long-term effects of your actions. It taught problem solving, how to deal with blights, droughts, or unexpected pests. It fostered a keen sense of observation as students learned to notice subtle changes in plant health, the behavior of insects, and the signs of impending weather. The act of gardening itself was considered a form of labor and devotion. It connected the students directly to the earth, to the cycle of life and death, and to the source of their sustenance. It was a holistic form of education that integrated physical work, intellectual curiosity, and spiritual reflection. It wasn't just about accumulating facts. It was about cultivating a relationship with the living world. Furthermore, these gardens often served as repositories of knowledge, preserving rare or important plant species. Monasteries exchanged seeds and cuttings with other monastic communities, effectively creating a network of botanical learning and preservation across medieval Europe. This informal network contributed to the spread of agricultural innovations and medicinal knowledge. In a world where abstract knowledge was highly valued, the Hortus Conclusus provided a grounded empirical learning experience. It taught students the value of direct observation, the intricacies of natural systems, and the profound connection between human well-being and the environment. It demonstrated that wisdom could be gleaned not just from ancient texts, but from the quiet wisdom of the earth itself, carefully cultivated within an enclosed living classroom. It teaches us that sometimes the best way to learn is to simply step outside, get your hands dirty, and listen to what nature has to teach.